Snow fell like artillery fire against the cabin windows, each impact a sharp crack that echoed through the log walls. The Sierra Nevada range had disappeared entirely, swallowed by a whiteout so complete that the world beyond the frosted glass had ceased to exist. The wind didn't howl. It roared, a deep primal sound that spoke of ancient mountains and the indifference of nature to the fragile constructions of men. Wyatt Brennan stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee from a cast-iron percolator that had belonged to his grandfather. The bitter smell cut through the scent of burning oak from the stone fireplace. He was 34 years old, but his hands moved with the deliberate economy of someone much older. Someone who had learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between life and death. His face was weathered beyond his years, carved by 2 tours in the Coringal Valley, and 3 years of grief so profound it had driven him to this isolated ridge 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. The power had been out for 4 hours. The blizzard had torn through the electrical grid like a reaper through wheat, leaving the mountain in darkness. But Wyatt had prepared for this. 3 cords of seasoned oak stacked under tarps, a pantry lined with enough canned goods to last until spring, battery-powered lanterns casting warm pools of yellow light across the heavy furniture, a Remington 870 pump-action shotgun resting against the coat closet loaded with buckshot always within reach. He had come to this mountain to escape the noise. The city had become unbearable after Nora died. Leukemia had taken her fast, a cruel arithmetic of declining white blood cell counts and midnight rushes to the emergency room. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, she had squeezed his hand one last time in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and failure, and whispered that he needed to take care of their little girl, that he needed to be strong. He had tried. God knows he had tried. Upstairs in the second bedroom with the hand-carved pine headboard, Bryn was sleeping. 7 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn refusal to be afraid of the dark. She slept with a stuffed rabbit named Clover tucked under one arm, her breathing soft and steady, trusting absolutely in the walls her father had built around her. Wyatt took a sip of the scalding coffee and walked to the front window. He pulled back the heavy canvas curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. Just white chaos, a wall of snow moving horizontally across his field of vision. The Weather Service had been screaming about this storm all week, a catastrophic convergence of moisture from the Pacific and Arctic air plunging down from Canada. They had predicted 3.5 feet of accumulation. Routes closed, power failures, isolated communities cut off for days. Perfect. That was why he had chosen this place. Up here, just off Route 89, winter didn't arrive politely. It attacked. It tested you. It reminded you that comfort was temporary and survival was earned. He had spent 18 months in Afghanistan living on forward operating bases that got mortared every third night, sleeping in bunkers carved from dirt, treating compound fractures and arterial bleeds with whatever supplies the helicopter resupply could bring in. The isolation of this mountain was nothing compared to the loneliness of watching 19-year-old kids bleed out in your hands while their buddies screamed for you to save them. He let the curtain fall back and returned to the kitchen. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the exposed log beams of the ceiling. He checked his watch. Just past 9 in the evening. He would bank the fire at 11, check on Bryn, and then try to sleep in the leather armchair facing the door. Old habits. You never slept with your back to an entrance. The sound hit him like a physical blow. Not the wind, not the creaking of snow-laden pine branches. This was mechanical. A low sputtering growl, multiple engines fighting against the storm, struggling up the steep incline of his unpaved driveway. The sound was wrong, ragged, desperate. The kind of noise machines make when they are pushed beyond their limits and are about to fail. Wyatt set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. His heart rate didn't spike. Instead, it settled into the slow, steady rhythm that combat had burned into his nervous system. He walked to the coat closet, bypassing the heavy winter parka and insulated gloves. His hand closed around the familiar synthetic stock of the Remington. He checked the chamber by fill alone. 5 rounds of 12-gauge buckshot, each shell capable of delivering 9 lead pellets in a spread pattern designed to stop a threat immediately. Nobody drove this far up the mountain in a storm that had already dropped 3 feet of snow. Nobody. The engines coughed and died one after another like a chain of mechanical failures. Then came the silence. Then came the sound that made Wyatt's grip tighten on the shotgun. Pounding. 3 massive impacts against the heavy oak door, each one shaking the frame, sending a vibration through the floorboards that Wyatt felt through the soles of his boots. This wasn't the frantic knocking of a lost hiker. This was the deliberate, authoritative hammering of men who were used to doors opening when they demanded it. Wyatt moved to the entryway, staying to the side of the door, away from the direct line of fire if someone decided to shoot through the wood. He didn't turn on his flashlight. His eyes were already adjusted to the dim light of the lanterns, and he wasn't about to give whoever was outside a target to aim at. "Who's there?" The words came out sharp, commanding pitch to cut through the drafts in the howling wind outside. A voice answered, rough as gravel, thick with cold, but carrying the unmistakable edge of desperation. "We need shelter. Route's completely iced over. Bikes are dead. We got men freezing out here." Bikes. Motorcycles. On a night like this. Wyatt's mind processed the information with clinical detachment. Anyone riding motorcycles in a blizzard wasn't out for a pleasure cruise. They were running from something, or towards something. Neither option was good. "How many?" Wyatt called back. 15. 15 men on his porch, in a storm that had cut him off from any outside help. His nearest neighbor was Old Man Jessup, a retired logger who lived 6 miles down the mountain and was probably snowed in himself. The sheriff's department was 45 minutes away in good weather. In this storm, they might as well be on the moon. Wyatt's mind split into 2 tracks. The medic in him, the man who had sworn an oath to preserve life, was already calculating hypothermia timelines. At these temperatures, with the wind chill factoring in exposed skin, would develop frostbite in minutes. Core body temperature would start dropping. Confusion, loss of motor control, cardiac arrest. If these men had been out in the storm for any length of time, they were dying. The father in him was calculating something else. Threat assessment, force ratios, defensive positions. If he opened that door, he was letting 15 unknowns into a confined space with his 7-year-old daughter sleeping upstairs. If they meant harm, he had 1 shotgun, a Glock 19 in the bedroom safe, and the benefit of knowing the terrain. Against 15 men, that wasn't much. But if he didn't open the door, he was sentencing men to death. The war between those 2 imperatives lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Wyatt made his choice. The same choice he had always made when the math was impossible and the stakes were absolute. He racked the shotgun. The metallic clack-clack of the pump action was universally understood. A warning. A statement of intent. "I hear you," Wyatt called out, "but understand this clearly. I'm armed. I have a child in this house. You will follow my rules or you will die on that porch. Are we clear?" There was a pause, then the voice again, and this time Wyatt could hear the chattering of teeth behind the words. "Crystal clear. We just need the fireman. We're not here for trouble." Wyatt unlocked the heavy deadbolt. He pulled the door open, exactly 4 inches, just enough to see out, keeping the barrel of the Remington pointed at center mass of whoever was on the other side. The wind screamed into the cabin, bringing with it a spray of snow so fine it was almost mist. Standing on the porch was a man who looked like he had been carved from granite and left out in a glacier. His beard was completely encased in ice. His face was raw and windburned, the skin an angry red that would blister by morning. But it was what he was wearing that made Wyatt's stomach tighten. A heavy leather vest, stiff with frost, with patches sewn across the back. Wyatt couldn't make out all the details in the dim light and the blowing snow, but he recognized the central image immediately. A winged death's head, the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Behind the giant, huddled against the log walls and half buried in the drifts, were 14 more men. They looked like a defeated army, heavy boots packed with snow. Denim jeans soaked through and freezing. Leather cuts that might as well have been paper for all the protection they offered against a high-altitude blizzard. A few of them were swaying on their feet, hypothermia starting to shut down their motor control. "Name's Reaper," the giant said, his voice barely intelligible through the shivering. The rocker on his vest read Oakland Chapter. "They call me president of this sorry crew. Look, I hear the shotgun. I respect it. But my brother Clutch is bleeding out from a slide, and the rest of us are going to be corpses in 20 minutes. You can shoot us, or you can let us in. Either way, this conversation is over real soon." Wyatt looked into Reaper's eyes. They were hard eyes, dangerous eyes. The kind of eyes you saw in men who had done things they couldn't take back. But right now, they held something else. Fear. Not the fear of the shotgun pointed at his chest. The fear of a leader who had run out of options and was watching his men die. Wyatt made a calculation. A cold tactical assessment of risk versus moral responsibility. Then he stepped back from the door. "All of you, step back from the door, 10 feet. Reaper raised his massive ice-encrusted hands in a gesture of surrender and barked an order over his shoulder. The shivering men shuffled backward into the storm, stumbling through the deep snow. Wyatt raised his voice, projecting it over the wind, the way he had projected orders across fire-based perimeters under mortar fire. "Here are the rules. You bring no weapons into my home. Every gun, every knife, every piece of metal you're carrying gets piled on the rug by the door. You make a wrong move, you disrespect my home, or you go anywhere near the second floor where my daughter is sleeping, and hypothermia will be the least of your problems. Do you understand how I'm doing?" Reaper nodded, his jaw set. "You have my word. We just need warmth." Wyatt pulled the door fully open and stepped aside. They filed in like battered titans emerging from a frozen hell. The smell hit him immediately. Wet leather exhaust fumes, ozone from the storm, and underneath it all, the sharp metallic tang of blood. They brought the cold with them, a wave of frigid air that made the fire in the hearth gutter and nearly go out. Wyatt slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. The sudden absence of wind made the cabin feel unnaturally quiet, broken only by the ragged breathing of 15 exhausted men and the crackle of the fire struggling to reassert itself. He positioned himself at the base of the stairs, the shotgun held in a low-ready position across his waist. His finger was off the trigger, but close. His eyes tracked each man as they processed his terms. Reaper didn't hesitate. With numb, fumbling fingers, he unzipped his frozen leather jacket and shrugged it off. From his waistband, he pulled a heavy Colt 1911 and laid it gently on top of his vest. Then a folding knife, then a set of brass knuckles. He turned to his men, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You heard the man. Unload." There was a moment of suffocating tension. These were men who lived by their own code. Men who didn't disarm for anyone. A younger angel, his face pale beneath a patchy beard, looked at Reaper with something close to panic. "Boss, we don't just—" "I said unload, Vandal," Reaper growled. "This man is saving our lives. We play by his rules." The angel called Vandal swallowed hard and nodded. Slowly, reluctantly, the metallic clatter began. Pistols of various makes and calibers. Hunting knives with blades long enough to gut a deer. A pair of heavy chains that looked like they had been pulled from a motorcycle. It piled up into a small arsenal on the entryway rug, a collection of weapons that spoke to lives lived on the edge of violence. Wyatt's eyes cataloged every piece, every face. He noted who looked angry, who looked scared, who looked like they were in shock. The man Reaper had called Vandal was the tall one, 6'4" at least, with a shaved head and an intricate spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. He was young, maybe 30, and he kept glancing toward the stairs. Wyatt made a mental note. That one bore watching. Another angel, massive and heavily tattooed, moved more carefully. This one had ink covering every visible inch of skin, including an elaborate dragon that wound down his right forearm. His eyes were older, wiser. He deposited his weapons without protest and then stood with his hands visible, non-threatening. That one understood the situation. "Sit by the fire." Wyatt instructed, his voice calmer now that the weapons were accounted for. Don't crowd it too fast, or you'll shock your systems. I'll get blankets. As he started to turn toward the linen closet, a sound stopped every single person in the room. A soft, sleepy voice from the top of the stairs, innocent and utterly trusting. Daddy. Time seemed to fracture. Wyatt's head snapped around. At the top of the stairs stood Bryn. She was wearing her oversized flannel pajamas, the ones with the little bears printed on them. Her dark hair was mussed from sleep. She clutched Clover the rabbit by one ear, rubbing her eyes with her free hand blinking against the dim light cast by the battery lanterns and the fire. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and total. 15 hardened bikers men, whose very presence could clear a bar or stop traffic, went rigid. The cursing stopped. The rough shifting of frozen limbs ceased. Even Vandal seemed to shrink slightly, as if trying to make himself less threatening. Wyatt felt a spike of pure primal terror. Not for himself, for her. He moved to the bottom of the stairs, positioning his body between his daughter and the room full of strangers. The shotgun was still in his hands, but he angled it down, trying to keep the threat implicit rather than overt. It's okay, Bug, Wyatt said, forcing his voice into the gentle, steady tone he used when she woke up from nightmares. We just have some guests who got stuck in the snow. They're cold and they're going to warm up by the fire. Then they'll leave. Go back to bed, sweetheart. But Bryn didn't retreat. She was curious by nature, fearless in the way that only children who have been loved and protected can be. She descended the first few steps, her small bare feet silent on the wooden treads. Her wide eyes took in the massive tattooed men filling her living room. She looked at Reaper, whose scarred face was illuminated by the firelight. She looked at Vandal. She looked at the man with the dragon tattoo who was staring at her like she was a ghost. The man with the dragon tattoo, Wyatt would later learn his name was Forged, did something unexpected. He tried to hide his tattooed hands behind his back, as if suddenly ashamed of the ink that covered his skin. His hard-lined face softened into something almost terrified. Not of Wyatt, not of the shotgun, of the little girl. Sorry to wake you, little miss, Vandal mumbled, his deep voice cracking slightly. The belligerence that had been in his eyes moments ago had evaporated entirely, replaced by awkward, almost desperate gentleness. Bryn stopped halfway down the stairs. She tilted her head, studying the men with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to fear. Are they cold, Daddy? Yes, sweetheart. They're very cold. Bryn nodded solemnly, as if this explained everything. I'll get my extra quilt. Before Wyatt could stop her, she turned and padded back down the upstairs hallway, her small form disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the lantern light. Wyatt let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked back at the room. The angels were staring at him with a mixture of emotions that Wyatt recognized from his time in the military. Respect, understanding, a profound, unspoken acknowledgement that everything had just changed. Reaper was looking at Wyatt with eyes that held a depth of understanding that transcended the circumstances. This wasn't just a man with a gun protecting his home anymore. This was a father protecting his daughter. And that was a code that even the Hell's Angels understood. You got a beautiful girl there, Reaper said quietly, clearing his throat. His voice had lost all of its earlier edge. We won't bring no trouble into her house. I swear it on my patch. Appreciate that, Wyatt replied. He moved to set the shotgun down behind the kitchen counter, out of sight, but still within reach. A gesture of trust, but a calculated one. Now, who's the one bleeding? A young man, barely more than a kid really, was propped up against the wall near the door. He was bone white, his lips tinged with blue, despite being inside. His denim jeans were shredded on the right leg, dark blood pooling steadily around his heavy boot and staining the hardwood floor. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. Shock. He was going into shock. His name's Clutch, Reaper said, hovering anxiously near the young man. He's a prospect. Caught a patch of black ice on a hairpin turn. Bike went out from under him, caught his leg between the exhaust pipe and a jagged section of guardrail. He's been losing blood for over an hour. The combat medic in Wyatt took over completely. The father, the cautious host, all of it vanished. Get him on the kitchen table, now. Vandal and another angel, a wiry man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, he moved immediately. They lifted Clutch as carefully as they could, but the young man still groaned in agony, his head lolling back. They swept a bowl of fruit and a stack of placemats off the heavy oak table and laid him on the surface. "What's your name?" Wyatt asked the wiry man as he sprinted toward the bathroom. "Blade." Blade hold pressured it on that wound. Direct pressure, both hands don't let up, no matter how much he screams. Wyatt grabbed his medical jump bag from the bathroom closet. It was a habit he had brought back from Afghanistan. Even out here in the middle of nowhere, he kept a fully stocked trauma kit. Hemostatic gauze, Israeli bandages, chest seals, airways, IV supplies. Everything he would need to keep someone alive until real help could arrive. He had restocked it religiously, hoping he would never need to use it again. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford tonight. He returned to the kitchen, snapping on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. He pulled out his brightest tactical flashlight and handed it to Reaper. "Hold this steady, right on the wound, don't move it." Reaper took the light without a word, his massive hands surprisingly steady. Wyatt grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears from his bag and cut away the thick blood-soaked denim. The fabric, peeled back, reluctantly stuck to the wound with congealed blood. Underneath was a mess, a jagged 6-inch laceration that ran deep into the calf muscle, dangerously close to where the tibial artery ran. The wound was contaminated with road grime, bits of asphalt, and shredded fabric. If that artery was nicked, Clutch would bleed out in minutes. "He needs a hospital," Wyatt said flatly, applying heavy direct pressure with a stack of gauze pads. Clutch's back arched off the table, a scream tearing from his throat that was barely human. "Roads are impassable," Blade said grimly, his hands covered in blood. "Tow trucks won't even try to come up here until the plows get through. That won't be until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." "Then he gets me," Wyatt muttered. "Hold him down. This is going to get worse." Vandal pinned Clutch's shoulders to the table with his considerable weight. Another angel grabbed Clutch's good leg. Forge, the man with the dragon tattoo, moved in without being asked and held Clutch's head, speaking quietly to him in a low, soothing rumble that Wyatt couldn't quite make out. Wyatt flushed the wound with copious amounts of sterile saline, ignoring the young man's muffled screams. He worked with brutal efficiency, the same methodical precision he had used in a field hospital outside Jalalabad when a convoy hit an IED and brought in 6 casualties at once. He irrigated, he debrided, he picked out bits of gravel and fabric with forceps, each piece another potential source of infection. The angels watched in stunned silence. These were men who were no strangers to violence, to pain, to damage. But watching this quiet, solitary man transition into a trauma surgeon on a kitchen table commanded a reverence that went beyond words. Bryn returned, dragging a massive, heavy quilt behind her. It was handmade, stitched by her grandmother years ago, one of the few things Wyatt had kept from the old house. She stopped at the edge of the kitchen, her eyes widening as she saw the blood, the young man on the table, her father bent over him with bloody hands. Forge immediately stepped between her and the table, blocking her view with his considerable bulk. He knelt down to her eye level, his road-worn face gentle. "Hey there, little miss," he said softly, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Thank you for this. Why don't you help your dad by getting some waters from the fridge? We're awful thirsty." Bryn nodded, distracted from the makeshift surgery. She went to the refrigerator, standing on her tiptoes to reach the bottled waters on the second shelf. She began handing them out to the terrifying men sitting on the floor, who accepted them with quiet, polite mumbles of "Thank you, ma'am," and "Much obliged, Miss Bryn." At the table, Wyatt had threaded a curved suture needle. He looked down at Clutch, whose eyes were glassy with pain and shock. "I don't have enough local anesthetic to numb this completely," Wyatt said honestly. "You're going to feel every stitch. I'm sorry." Clutch managed a weak nod, his jaw clenched. "Do it." Wyatt began to suture. In, out, tie off. In, out, tie off. His hands were machines, steady and precise. The only sounds in the cabin were the wind outside, Clutch's ragged breathing, and the soft snip of surgical scissors. 27 stitches. Each one a small act of controlled violence in service of healing. As Wyatt was finishing the final layer, closing the skin with a running subcuticular stitch, that would leave minimal scarring, he reached blindly toward the pile of Clutch's gear that had been dumped on a chair next to the table. His hand brushed against a leather saddlebag unbuckled during the crash. The heavy flap fell open. Wyatt froze. Inside the saddlebag, illuminated perfectly by the spill of Reaper's tactical flashlight, were neat, tightly wrapped bricks of cash. Hundreds of them. The bills were bound with rubber bands stacked in rows. Wyatt's mind, trained to make quick assessments, estimated it at a glance. $800,000. Maybe more. Beneath the cash, partially visible, was the dull gleam of an automatic weapon, a suppressor threaded onto the barrel. The temperature in the kitchen dropped 30 degrees in the span of a heartbeat, colder than the blizzard raging outside. Reaper saw it. The flashlight beam wavered for a fraction of a second, the only outward sign of the man's reaction. Wyatt looked up slowly from the wound, his hand still holding the curved needle and suture thread. His eyes locked with the Hells Angels president. The fragile trust they had built over the last 40 minutes hung by a thread thinner than the surgical suture in Wyatt's hands. This wasn't a joyride gone wrong in a storm. This was something else, something bigger. And Wyatt Brennan had just seen behind a curtain that men were killed for looking at. The cabin was absolutely silent except for Clutch's labored breathing and the distant howl of the wind. 15 angels watched Wyatt. Reaper's hand was inches from where his Colt had been before he disarmed. Vandal had shifted his weight, ready to move. Even Forge had gone still, his eyes on Wyatt. Wyatt held Reaper's gaze for 3 long seconds. He didn't reach for the shotgun behind the counter. He didn't shout. He didn't demand explanations. Instead, he reached over, grabbed the leather flap of the saddlebag, and closed it, deliberately, calmly, hiding the contents from view. He turned back to the wound, snipped the final thread, and wrapped Clutch's calf in a clean compression bandage with the same methodical care he had used for the entire procedure. "Keep his leg elevated," Wyatt said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "If he spikes a fever, wake me up. Otherwise, let him rest." He stripped off his bloody gloves and threw them in the trash. Then he turned to face Reaper fully. The two men stood 3 feet apart, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them like a physical presence. "I didn't see anything in that bag, Reaper," Wyatt said quietly. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper that only the president could hear. He pointed toward the living room where Bryn was carefully distributing water bottles to grateful, tattooed hands. "I saw a man bleeding out and I fixed him. That's where my involvement ends. You and your men are guests in my home until the storm breaks. But if whatever trouble follows, that money comes to my door and threatens my daughter, I won't use the buckshot. I'll use the slugs." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had made harder choices in worse circumstances. Reaper didn't bristle at the threat. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. His weathered face held something that looked almost like respect. "We're ghosts, Wyatt," Reaper replied, his voice equally quiet, equally sincere. "We were never here, and no trouble will cross your threshold. You have the word of the Hells Angels." Wyatt walked to the sink and washed the blood from his hands, watching the red water spiral down the drain. Behind him, the angels were settling in. Forge was spreading Bryn's quilt over Clutch, who had finally passed out from exhaustion and pain. Vandal was adding logs to the fire. Blade was quietly organizing the pile of weapons by the door, making sure nothing was in a position where it could accidentally discharge. Bryn appeared at Wyatt's elbow, looking up at him with sleepy eyes. "Did you fix him, Daddy?" "Yeah, Bug, I fixed him." "Good," she yawned, showing all her small teeth. "I like Forge. He's nice. He said he has daughters, too." Wyatt felt something twist in his chest. His 7-year-old daughter had just handed out water to some of the most dangerous men in America, and she thought they were nice because one of them had daughters. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. I'll be up in a little bit to check on you." Bryn nodded and padded back toward the stairs. Forge, without being asked, walked her to the bottom step and waited until she was safely at the top before returning to his spot by the fire. Wyatt dried his hands and looked around the cabin. 15 outlaws were sprawled across his living room, wrapped in every spare blanket and sleeping bag he owned. The smell of wet leather and wood smoke filled the air. The fire crackled, Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. He had just performed surgery on a kitchen table for a motorcycle gang, carrying nearly $1 million in cash and an illegal automatic weapon. He had lied by omission about what he had seen. He had made a choice to protect men he didn't know for reasons he wasn't entirely sure he understood. Wyatt picked up his coffee mug, found it cold, and poured it down the sink. He grabbed the Remington from behind the counter and walked to the high-backed leather armchair in the corner of the room. He sat down the shotgun resting across his thighs and settled in to watch. The hours between midnight and dawn were going to be very long. Reaper didn't sleep either. The Oakland president sat cross-legged by the fire, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, his eyes locked on the flames. But Wyatt knew the man was acutely aware of his every movement. Around 3 in the morning, when most of the angels had finally succumbed to exhaustion and were snoring in various states of disarray across the floor, Reaper spoke. He didn't look at Wyatt. He just stared into the fire and began to talk, his voice low enough that it wouldn't wake the others. The kid on the table, Clutch. His real name is Evan Morrison. His old man was Axel Morrison. We called him Axe. He was a legend in the club. 32 years he wore the patch. Rode with us through wars, through federal investigations, through things I can't talk about. Reaper paused, took a sip of cold coffee, grimaced. About 6 months ago, the Reno cartel decided they wanted a piece of Axe's business. He ran a legitimate trucking company, moved freight up and down the coast. They tried to muscle in, wanted him to move their product. He told them to go to hell. So they made an example of him. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. They didn't kill him outright. That would have been a mercy. They bled him dry, extorted him for $420,000, took his trucking company, took his house, took the family farm that had been in the Morrison family for 3 generations. Clutch's mother, Diane, she couldn't handle it. She took a bottle of pills and didn't wake up. 2 weeks later, Axe had a massive stroke, died in the hospital with his kid holding his hand. Wyatt listened without interrupting. He had heard stories like this before in different contexts, different wars. The shape of tragedy was universal. That money in the bag, Reaper continued, still not looking at Wyatt. We didn't steal it. We took it back. Every last dollar that the cartel bled from Axe's family. We hit their stash house in Reno, got the keys, and rode out. They weren't happy to see us leave with it. They chased us into the mountains. We took Route 89 to lose them in the storm, knowing their trucks couldn't handle the ice like our bikes could. But we pushed too hard. Clutch went down on that hairpin. If you hadn't opened that door, he would have died on your porch, his father's son bleeding out in the snow. Reaper finally turned to look at Wyatt. His eyes hardened by decades of violence and loyalty to a code most people would never understand, held a weight of sincerity that couldn't be faked. We're not criminals looking to rob a bank, Wyatt. We're brothers making things right for a kid who lost everything. But the people we took it from, they're not the forgiving type. Are they coming up this mountain? Wyatt asked, his voice flat, the soldier in him already calculating defensive positions in fields of fire. No, Reaper said firmly. The storm closed the pass behind us. Nobody is getting up here until the plows come through tomorrow, and by then we'll be long gone. You and your little girl are safe, that's a promise. Wyatt looked at the frosted windows, the darkness beyond the relentless wind. I hope you're right, Reaper, for all our sakes. The 2 men sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting. And in that isolated cabin, perched on a high ridge in the Sierra Nevada mountains, an unspoken understanding had been reached between 2 men from completely different worlds. They had both lost people they loved. They both understood what it meant to fight for what remained. And they both knew that sometimes the only thing standing between survival and death was the willingness of a stranger to open a door in a storm. As the first gray hints of dawn began to fight their way through the eastern windows, Wyatt finally allowed himself to close his eyes. Not to sleep, just to rest them for a moment. The Remington remained across his lap, his hand resting lightly on the stock. 15 Hells Angels were asleep in his living room. A young man with 27 stitches in his leg was breathing steadily on his couch. Nearly $1 million in pixie and an illegal weapon were hidden in a saddlebag 10 feet away. And upstairs, his 7-year-old daughter slept peacefully, trusting absolutely in her father's ability to keep the wolves at bay. Wyatt had made his choice. He had closed the saddlebag. He had given his word that he had seen nothing. And whatever came next, whatever consequences followed from this night, he would face them the same way he had faced everything else since Nora died. With his daughter behind him and a weapon in his hands, in the absolute certainty that some lines could never be crossed. The storm raged on. Dawn came with a blinding, pristine brilliance that seemed impossible after the violence of the night. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime around 5 in the morning, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence that was almost louder than the wind had been. Sunlight poured through the cabin windows, reflecting off 3.5 feet of fresh powder that had erased every trace of the world that existed before. The pine trees were so heavy with snow, they bent like old men under the weight. The driveway had ceased to exist. Wyatt had not slept. He sat in the leather armchair with the Remington across his lap, watching the slow transition from darkness to gray to the sharp, clean light of a winter morning. His body ached with a peculiar exhaustion that comes from remaining motionless for hours while your mind refuses to rest. Every creak of settling logs, every shift of a sleeping angel on his floor, had registered in his consciousness like a ping on a radar screen. But nothing had happened. The angels had slept like dead men, some of them snoring loud enough to rival the wind. Clutch had made it through the night without spiking a fever, his breathing steady, his color slowly returning from corpse gray to something closer to human. And upstairs, Bryn had slept through everything, cocooned in her flannel pajamas, in her absolute faith that her father could handle anything. By first light, the angels were stirring the way soldiers wake in unfamiliar territory, quickly and silently. Forge unfolded from the floor near the hearth. Reaper checked the windows. Within an hour, all 15 were on their feet. Wyatt stood his knees popping and set the Remington on the mantel where it would remain visible, but not threatening. He walked to the kitchen and fired up the industrial gas stove. The propane tank was full. He could cook. "Anyone allergic to anything?" he called out to the room. A few heads shook. Vandal spoke up. "We're grateful for whatever you got, man. We're not picky." Wyatt pulled out flour, eggs, buttermilk. The griddle hissed. Bacon sizzled. The smell filled the cabin like a prayer. Forge moved to help without being asked. Plates up there. Mugs by the sink. They worked in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that forms between men who've survived something together. Bryn appeared at the stairs, drawn by the bacon. "Are the scary men still here?" Forge knelt to her level. "We're not scary, little miss, just big." He showed her the dragon tattoo winding down his forearm. "You gotta earn dragons." "I like dragons," Bryn declared. Vandal sat on the floor so she could trace the spiderweb crawling up his neck. Her small finger followed the pattern, completely unafraid. Wyatt stacked pancakes, distributed coffee. The angel ate like men who'd been given a second chance, grateful, quiet, reverent. Around 9, Clutch woke. Wyatt checked his leg, no fever wound, clean, healing well. He handed the young man water and Tylenol. Clutch caught his wrist. "Mr. Brennan, that money, it's not what you think." Wyatt sat on the couch edge. "Tell me." The words came out broken. "My dad, Axel Morrison, we called him Axe, ran Morrison Trucking. Legit freight, 30 years. Reno cartel wanted him to move drugs. He said no. They bled him for 420 and protection money. Took the company, took our house, took the family farm, 3 generations gone." Clutch's voice cracked. "My mom couldn't handle watching them destroy him. Pills. Didn't wake up. 2 weeks later, Dad had a stroke. I was holding his hand when he died. Last thing he said, 'Don't let them win, Evan.'" Tears ran down the young man's face. "The club voted unanimous. We were going to take back what they stole. For Dad's name. Hit their stash house, took exactly what they took from us. 850. And they chased us into this storm." Wyatt stood, walked to the window, looked out at the white mountains. 15 angels waited for judgment. "Your father stood by his principles when it cost him everything," Wyatt said finally. "That's rare. The money stays in the bag. When you can ride, you take it and honor his memory. Understood. Clutch nodded, unable to speak. Reaper shook Wyatt's hand. The grip said what words couldn't. Then the radio crackled. Unit Alpha, this is base. Come in. Every head in the cabin turned toward the shortwave emergency radio on the kitchen counter. Wyatt moved quickly, turning up the volume. Base, this is Unit Alpha. We're at Route 89 incline. Road is still impassable for trucks. But we got something. Tracks. What kind of tracks? Motorcycles. A whole mess of them. 15, maybe 20 bikes. They headed up the mountain before the snow dumped the hardest. Tracks are mostly buried now, but we can see the pattern. They went up. They didn't come down. The temperature in the cabin dropped 30 degrees. Angels were on their feet, hands instinctively moving toward weapons that weren't there. Wyatt held up a hand for silence. A different voice came through the radio. This one was cold, precise, with a faint accent. Unit Alpha, this is Ramirez. Deploy the snowmobiles. Follow those tracks. If they dug in somewhere up there, you find them. You recover the package. You eliminate all witnesses. Every single one. Are we clear? Crystal, sir. We have 8 sleds fueled and ready. 16 men armed. We'll find them. Do not fail me, Alpha. That money belongs to the Sinaloa cartel, and anyone who took it is already dead. They just don't know it yet. The radio went silent. Wyatt turned to face the room. The angels were standing in various stages of alarm and readiness. Reaper's face had gone hard as granite. Vandal was clenching and unclenching his fists. Forge had moved instinctively to place himself between Bryn and the front door. How long? Wyatt asked Reaper. 30 minutes. Maybe less if they push hard. Can you make it out the back on foot? Reaper shook his head. Not through 4 feet of powder with Clutch unable to walk. We'd make it 50 yards before hypothermia set in. They'd track us down and execute us in the snow. Then we hold here, Wyatt said. The soldier in him took command. This cabin sits on a high ridge. The only vehicle access is the driveway, which is a narrow choke point between the tree line on the left and a 60-foot ravine on the right. It's a fatal funnel. Anyone coming up that path has no cover and no room to maneuver. This is your home, Reaper protested. Your daughter is here. We can't bring this fight to your door. They just announced they're coming to my door, Wyatt said flatly. They're not distinguishing between you and me. They said eliminate all witnesses. That includes me. That includes Bryn. The reality of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. The cartel wasn't coming for just the angels. They were coming to erase everyone who might have seen anything, a father and his 7-year-old daughter included. How defensible is this position? Blade asked, scanning the terrain through the window. Wyatt pointed outside. Fatal funnel up the driveway, high ground here. Interlocking fields of fire from the windows. I held FOB Griffin and Krengal against 40 Taliban with 12 men. I know how to turn a bad position into a nightmare for attackers. He turned to Bryn, who was watching with wide eyes, sensing the change, but not understanding it. Bug, come here. She slid off her stool and walked to him. He knelt down, taking her small hands in his. Remember the game we played last month, the bunker game? Bryn nodded. When I go downstairs and stay quiet. That's right, we're going to play that game now. I need you to go to your room, grab Clover, and meet me at the pantry. Can you do that? Are the bad men coming, Daddy? Wyatt chose truth. Yes, honey, some bad men are coming, but they're not going to get past this porch. Do you know why? Because you're the bravest, Bryn said with absolute certainty. Because I have something to protect, Wyatt corrected gently. You and I will never, ever let anyone hurt you, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that? Bryn squared her small shoulders. I can be brave. Good girl, go get Clover. Quick now. She ran upstairs. Wyatt stood and turned to the angels. I need a count. How many of you have combat experience? Hands went up. Reaper, Forge, Blade, Vandal. 4 others. 8 total, including Wyatt. Rifles, shotguns, anything with range. What you saw is what we have, Reaper said. Pistols, a couple of hunting rifles in the saddlebags we left outside. We weren't planning for a war. Then we make do. Wyatt walked to the coat closet and pulled out a long black case. He unzipped it to reveal a Ruger AR-15 with a scope and 3 30-round magazines. I have this, the Remington, my Glock, and about 200 rounds of various calibers. He pulled out a wooden crate from the back of the closet. Inside were 6 road flares, the kind used for emergencies. We have these, and we have the terrain. Bryn came back down with Clover. Wyatt led her to the pantry and pulled back the heavy rug, revealing the trap door to the root cellar. He opened it, exposing a ladder that descended into darkness. He climbed down first, then reached up for Bryn. The cellar was lined with stone reinforced with timber. It was stocked with emergency supplies, water-canned food, blankets, a battery-powered lantern. Wyatt had built it himself when he first bought the cabin, some part of him that had survived Afghanistan, insisting on a fallback position. He set up the lantern and handed Bryn her iPad already charged. You put on your noise-canceling headphones, you watch your movie, and you do not come out until I open this door and tell you it's safe. Do you understand? What if you don't come back? Her voice was very small. Wyatt pulled her into a tight hug. I will always come back to you, Bug, always. That's a promise I made to your mom, and I have never broken a promise to her. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, memorizing it. Then he climbed the ladder and closed the trap door. He slid the rug back and dragged a heavy sack of flour over the door. From above, it was invisible. When he returned to the living room, the angels were arming themselves from the pile by the door. Reaper handed Wyatt his weapons back with a look that said everything words couldn't. Positions, Wyatt said. Vandal grit, second-floor dormer windows. You have the high angle on the driveway. Blade, you're with them, covering fire only. Aim for the snowmobiles, not the riders. I want them trapped, not dead if we can help it. Why not dead, Vandal asked. Because 16 bodies bring the FBI. 16 survivors who run away in terror bring nothing but rumors. Wyatt turned to Reaper. You and Forge behind the stone fireplace. It'll stop pistol rounds. You flank anyone who makes it to the porch. He looked at the remaining angels. The rest of you spread out. Use the log walls for cover. They're thick enough to stop rifle rounds. No one fires until I give the word. Understood? Why you? One of the angels asked. Not hostile, just curious. Because I've done this before, Wyatt said simply. FOB Griffin, Korangal Valley, summer of 2019. 40 Taliban fighters tried to overrun our position with 12 of us defending. We held for 8 hours until air support arrived. I know how to turn a bad position into a nightmare for attackers. He handed out the road flares. When I tell you light these and throw them into the driveway, the smoke will blind them. The heat signature will mess up any thermal optics they might have. Reaper gripped Wyatt's shoulder. You're doing this for us. I'm doing this for Bryn, Wyatt corrected. You're just benefiting from the same defense. He picked up the Remington and loaded it with slugs instead of buckshot. 1-ounce lead projectiles designed to punch through engine blocks. He chambered around and moved to the front window. The sound reached them before the visual. The high-pitched whine of 2-stroke engines growing louder. Multiple machines pushing hard through the snow. Wyatt parted the curtain slightly. 8 snowmobiles crested the final rise of the driveway, throwing up rooster tails of powder. They moved in a tactical formation, 2 up front, as point the rest spread in a wedge. The riders were dressed in white and black winter tactical gear helmets with tinted visors, and slung across their backs or held in gloved hands, Wyatt could see the distinctive profiles of assault rifles. They weren't here to talk. The snowmobiles fanned out in the clearing in front of the cabin, engines cutting one by one. The sudden silence was absolute. 16 men dismounted, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't street thugs. These were trained operators. The lead figure pulled out a megaphone. Hell's Angels, we know you're in there. The house is surrounded. Send out the saddlebag and we'll make your deaths quick. Keep it and we burn this cabin to the foundation with everyone inside. Inside the cabin, Forge had moved instinctively to where he could shield the trapdoor with his body. Vandal's hands were white-knuckled on his pistol. Reaper was looking at Wyatt, waiting for the call. Wyatt stepped back from the window. He looked at each angel, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. These men had chosen their path long ago. They knew the risks, but Wyatt had a choice to make right now. He could hand over the money, hope they took it and left, gamble that they would honor their word and spare everyone. Or he could trust his training and his terrain and fight. The image of Bryn in that cellar wearing her noise-canceling headphones, trusting absolutely that her father would protect her, made the choice simple. Wyatt walked to the door and kicked it open with his boot. He stepped onto the porch, the Remington raised and locked against his shoulder. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but he didn't flinch. "This is private property!" Wyatt roared, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded troops under fire. "You have 5 seconds to turn those sleds around and get off my mountain." The cartel leader lowered the megaphone. Even at 40 yards, Wyatt could see the man's expression shift from confidence to confusion. He had been expecting terrified bikers. He had found a trained soldier in a fortified position. The leader raised an AK-47, aiming it at Wyatt's chest. "You're making a mistake, civilian. You're a dead man." Wyatt didn't wait for the 5 seconds. He didn't hesitate. He had made his calculation and his choice. He squeezed the trigger. The Remington roared a concussive boom that shattered the mountain silence and rolled down the valley like thunder. Wyatt hadn't aimed at the leader. He had aimed at the lead snowmobile. The 1-ounce slug hit the engine cowling at 1,200 feet per second and tore through it like tissue paper. The engine blocks shattered, sending fragments of metal and sparks into the air. Gasoline ignited, creating a small fireball that engulfed the machine. Before the cartel men could even process what had happened, before they could bring their weapons to bear, Wyatt racked the slide and yelled one word: "Now." The word hung in the frozen air for a heartbeat, a single syllable that unleashed hell. The cabin erupted with the coordinated fury of men who had been given permission to survive. From the second-floor dormer windows, Vandal and Blade opened fire, not aiming for flesh, but for the machinery that had brought death to Wyatt's doorstep. The sharp crack of pistol fire mixed with the deeper boom of a hunting rifle someone had retrieved from the saddlebags outside. Glass windshields on the snowmobiles exploded into crystalline dust. Plastic cowlings shattered. Metal sparked where bullets found their marks. From the ground floor, Reaper and Forge fired in disciplined 3-round bursts, the way men who understood suppressing fire were supposed to shoot. They weren't trying to kill. They were creating a wall of lead that made the open clearing in front of the cabin absolutely untenable for anyone standing in it. The cartel enforcers had expected to find wounded, freezing bikers cowering in the dark. They had not expected a fortified position with overlapping fields of fire and a defender who understood that superior numbers meant nothing when you controlled the terrain. They scattered like startled birds, diving behind their snowmobiles, scrambling for cover that didn't exist in 3 feet of snow. Wyatt fired a second slug. The heavy projectile caught the second snowmobile's track assembly and tore it apart, metal shredding with a sound like a scream. The machine lurched sideways, useless. "Flares!" Wyatt shouted. Angels struck the road flares against the stone hearth, the chemical igniters hissing to life in brilliant red flame. They hurled them through the shattered windows. The flares arced through the air and landed in the snow around the clearing, spewing thick white smoke that was designed to be visible for miles. Within seconds, the tactical visibility collapsed. The cartel enforcers were shooting blind, their muzzle flashes visible in the smoke, but their aim wildly off. A burst of AK-47 fire stitched across the front of the cabin, bullets punching through wood and glass. One round passed so close to Wyatt's head that he felt the supersonic crack of its passage. He dropped to one knee behind the heavy log railing of the porch and chambered another slug. "Hold!" he screamed over the gunfire. "Cease fire!" The Angels, to their credit, stopped shooting immediately. The discipline was remarkable. The cartel kept firing for another few seconds, panic shooting into smoke and perceived threats before their ammunition started to run low and their leader regained enough control to shout orders in Spanish. The shooting stopped. The smoke drifted across the clearing, thick and acrid. The smell of gunpowder and burning chemical compound filled the air. Wyatt's ears rang from the concussive blast in the confined space. He racked the Remington one more time. The sound carried across the silence like a promise, a threat, a statement of absolute intent. "You've got 4 working sleds left," Wyatt shouted into the smoke. His voice was calm, conversational, the tone of a man discussing the weather rather than a firefight. 3 of your machines are destroyed. You're standing in open snow with no cover. I'm in a fortified position with high ground and interlocking fields of fire. Do the math. The smoke began to clear, pulled apart by the mountain wind. The cartel leader was crouched behind one of the ruined snowmobiles, his white tactical gear splattered with gasoline and melted plastic. His helmet visor was up, and Wyatt could see his face now. Young, maybe 35, with hard eyes that right now held the dawning realization that he had walked into a trap. The next volley won't be aimed at your engines. Wyatt continued, his Remington pointed at center mass on the leader. You drop your weapons in the snow, you put your wounded on whatever sleds still run, and you walk back down that mountain. You come back and I'll bury you in the ravine where nobody will ever find you. The cartel leader looked at the shattered remains of his convoy. He looked up at the cabin where he could see the barrels of multiple weapons trained on him from windows and firing positions. He looked at his men, half of whom were wounded from flying debris and ricochets, all of whom were realizing they had been outmaneuvered by superior tactics. He made the calculation that survivors make when survival becomes more important than pride. Bajen las armas, he ordered. Drop your weapons. One by one, the AK-47s and pistols fell into the snow. The cartel enforcers raised their hands, moving slowly, carefully. They helped their wounded onto the 4 remaining functional snowmobiles, cramming 2 and 3 men onto machines designed for 1. It was a humiliating retreat, and every man there knew it. The leader was the last to mount up. He stared at Wyatt across 40 yards of torn snow and gun smoke. You just made an enemy of the Sinaloa cartel. I just defended my home, Wyatt replied. What you choose to do with that information is your problem, not mine. The snowmobile started with coughing reluctance, engines damaged from the close calls and debris. They turned and began the long, slow descent down the mountain, leaving behind 3 destroyed machines, 14 discarded weapons, and the crushing weight of their failure. Wyatt stood on the porch, the Remington still at his shoulder, and watched until the sound of the engines faded completely into the vast silence of the Sierra Nevada. Only when he was certain they were gone, when the mountain had reclaimed its stillness, did he lower the weapon. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was draining away, leaving behind the hollow, trembling aftermath that every soldier knows. His legs felt weak. His heart was hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He turned around and looked at the cabin. The angels were emerging from their positions, stunned expressions on their scarred features. Bullet holes had stitched patterns across the log walls. Glass littered the floor. Smoke still hung in the air like a ghost. Reaper walked to the edge of the porch, his Colt still in his hand, and stared down the mountain where the cartel had disappeared. Then he turned to look at Wyatt. The expression on the Angels' president's face was something beyond respect. It was awe. Remind me, Reaper said slowly, his voice thick with something that might have been emotion, to never, ever piss off a father. Wyatt didn't respond. He walked straight to the pantry, his movements jerky and uncoordinated as the adrenaline crash hit him. He shoved the flour sack aside and pulled open the trap door. Bryn, he called down into the darkness. His voice cracked. Bug, it's over. It's safe. You can come up now. There was a pause that lasted 1,000 years. Then the glow of the lantern appeared at the bottom of the ladder, and Bryn's small face looked up at him. She still had her noise-canceling headphones on, pulled down around her neck. Her eyes were wide, but there were no tears. Are the bad men gone, Daddy? They're gone, Bug. Wyatt reached down and lifted her out of the cellar, pulling her against his chest and holding her so tightly she made a small sound of protest. He buried his face in her hair and just breathed, feeling her small heart beating against his ribs, alive and safe and whole. I was brave, Bryn said into his shoulder. I didn't cry, even once. You were so brave, Wyatt whispered. I'm so proud of you. When he finally set her down, the Angels were standing in a rough semicircle watching. Forge had tears running down his scarred face. Vandal was staring at the floor, his massive shoulders shaking slightly. Even Blade, who looked like he had never shown emotion in his life, had to look away. Bryn walked over to Clutch, who was still on the couch with his leg elevated, and climbed up to sit beside him. Did my daddy save you again? Clutch, pale and exhausted, managed a smile. Yeah, little miss, your daddy saved all of us. Again. The rest of the day passed in cleanup and recovery. The angels dragged the ruined snowmobiles into the ravine where they tumbled down 60 feet and disappeared into the snow. They collected every spent shell casing, every bullet fragment, every piece of evidence that a firefight had occurred. Wyatt boarded up the broken windows with plywood. He swept up the glass. He patched the bullet holes in the walls with wood filler. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the cabin looked almost normal. That night, they ate canned stew heated over the gas stove. They drank water and coffee. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't need to. Men who have survived combat together don't need to process it with words. The silence is its own acknowledgement. Bryn fell asleep on the couch next to Clutch, exhausted from being brave. Wyatt carried her upstairs and tucked her into bed, and for the first time in 3 years, he said a prayer. Not to any specific God, just a thank you to whatever force in the universe had let him keep her safe. When he came back downstairs, Reaper was waiting for him. "We'll leave at first light," the president said. "The plows should have Route 89 clear by noon. We can ride out, disappear. You'll never see us again." Wyatt nodded. That was the smart play. The safe play. Let the ghost vanish and pretend this had never happened. "Wyatt," Reaper said quietly, "what you did today, that wasn't just tactics. That was laying down your life for people you don't know, for a fight that wasn't yours." "It became mine the moment they said they'd burn this cabin with everyone in it," Wyatt replied. "They threatened my daughter. That made it personal." Still, Reaper pulled something from his pocket. It was a small silver medallion on a heavy chain. The Hells Angels' death's head, but different. This one had no club text, just a shield engraved beneath the skull. "This belonged to my father. He gave it to me before he died. It means safe passage, a promise of blood and iron. I want you to have it." "I can't take that." "You already earned it." Reaper pressed the medallion into Wyatt's hand. "You saved Clutch's life on that table. You saved the rest of us on that porch. You have a marker with the Hells Angels now, Wyatt Brennan, a marker that never expires. Whatever you need whenever you need it, you show that medallion and we come. All of us." Wyatt looked down at the heavy silver in his palm. "I just want you to get your men home safe, Reaper." "We will. But this thing between us, it's not finished. You don't walk through fire with men and then just shake hands and part ways. That's not how this works." The president was right and Wyatt knew it. Something had been forged here that was stronger than circumstance, a bond that transcended the normal rules of society. He had stepped outside the law to protect these men, had lied by omission about what he had seen, had engaged in a firefight to defend them. He was complicit now, changed. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it just felt inevitable. 3 weeks later, on a cold afternoon in early February, Sheriff Hollis Crane drove up the mountain with Deputy Knox in the passenger seat. Wyatt was outside chopping firewood when he heard the engine. His hand moved instinctively to the Glock he now kept holstered at his hip, even during daylight hours. The sheriff's SUV rolled to a stop near the porch. Crane stepped out, a man in his late 50s with steel-gray hair and the patient, watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He had been sheriff of Sierra County for 30 years, and he had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. "Afternoon, Wyatt," Crane called out, adjusting his duty belt. "Everything all right up here? You survived the big freeze, okay?" "Survived it just fine, Sheriff." Wyatt buried the axe in the chopping block and walked over, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed. "Lost power for a while, but we had enough firewood to ride it out." Deputy Knox was younger, maybe 30, and he was looking around the property with the sharp attention of someone trained to notice details. Wyatt's pulse elevated slightly, but he kept his face neutral. "Reason we're checking in," Crane said, his tone conversational, "is we found something strange down at the base of your ridge a few weeks back, right after the plows came through." "Strange how?" "Found 3 abandoned snowmobiles, smashed to pieces, looked like the engine blocks had been blown out. We also found a lot of blood in the snow near the tree line and 14 weapons. AK-47s, pistols, tactical gear. The kind of hardware you don't see at the local sporting goods store. Wyatt let a beat of silence pass as if he was thinking about it. That is strange. Yeah. Crane's eyes were locked on Wyatt's face, reading every micro-expression. You hear anything unusual during the storm? Gunfire, maybe snowmobiles running up this way. Wyatt looked out over the mountain, letting his gaze drift to the distant peaks. When he spoke, his voice was absolutely steady. Sheriff, the windup here was hitting 80 miles an hour. I couldn't hear myself think, let alone hear engines or gunfire down in the valley. Could have been a lot of things. Poachers shooting at each other, drug runners having a dispute. Hell, could have been kids joyriding and hitting the rocks under the powder. We checked the local hospitals, Deputy Knox interjected. No trauma admissions matching the timeline. No bodies found, just blood and abandoned gear. Wish I could help you, Wyatt said, offering a polite, slightly apologetic smile. But me and Bryn were just huddled around the fire trying to stay warm. We didn't see or hear anything. Crane studied him for a long moment. Then the sheriff's gaze drifted to the cabin, taking in the fresh wood filler in a few spots on the exterior walls, the new plywood over one window that Wyatt had claimed cracked from ice pressure. You know what I think, Wyatt? Crane said slowly. Wyatt's hand was inches from his Glock, though he kept it relaxed at his side. What's that, Sheriff? I think those snowmobiles belong to cartel enforcers out of Reno. I think they were chasing someone up this mountain, and I think they ran into something they weren't expecting. I think there was a fight and the people they were chasing won. The silence stretched out between them. Wyatt didn't confirm or deny. He just waited. Crane sighed and looked back toward his SUV. You know what else I think? I think the world is a slightly better place with 3 fewer cartel snowmobiles and 14 fewer illegal weapons on the street. I think sometimes the law and justice aren't quite the same thing. And I think a man has a right to defend his home and his daughter by any means necessary. He turned back to Wyatt and extended his hand. You take care of yourself and that little girl, Wyatt. You hear anything unusual in the future, you give me a call. Wyatt shook his hand, understanding the unspoken message. Crane knew, or at least he suspected enough to know, and he was choosing to look the other way. Appreciate you checking in, Sheriff. That's my job. Crane climbed back into the SUV. Knox followed, though the deputy kept glancing back at the cabin like he wanted to ask more questions. But Crane was his superior, and if the sheriff was letting this go, Knox would follow his lead. The SUV backed up, turned around, and headed down the mountain. Wyatt stood in the cold and watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend. He had just lied to law enforcement, had aided and abetted known criminals, had covered up a firefight that could have resulted in multiple deaths. And he had done it all to protect men who had invaded his home, carrying illegal weapons and nearly $1 million in cash. The weight of that settled on his shoulders like wet snow, heavy, inescapable, changing the shape of who he was. But when he looked through the cabin window and saw Bryn sitting at the kitchen table drawing a picture of a dragon next to a wooden horse that Forge had carved, he knew he would make the same choice again. Some lines once crossed define you. 6 weeks after the sheriff's visit on a bright morning in early March, Wyatt was in the workshop behind the cabin when he felt it. Not a sound at first, a vibration, a deep rhythmic trembling that traveled up through the ground and into the soles of his work boots. He stepped outside, frowning. The sky was cloudless, a perfect Sierra blue. The snow had mostly melted, leaving patches of brown earth and the first brave shoots of green grass. Bryn was down by the tree line trying to catch butterflies in the warming air. The vibration grew stronger, and then the sound reached him, a massive rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The deep, synchronized roar of engines. Not 15, not even 30. More. Wyatt's hand went to his Glock. Combat instincts flared. He scanned the tree line, calculating angles and escape routes. Then he saw the first bike crest, the final bend of the driveway. Leading the pack, his massive frame, unmistakable even at a distance, was Reaper. Flanking him were Forge and Vandal, but it was what came behind them that made Wyatt's breath catch in his chest. A river of chrome and leather poured up the mountain 2 by 2 in perfect military formation. Heavy V-twin motorcycles, their engines creating a sound that shook pine cones from the trees. They wore rockers from Oakland, from Vallejo, from Sacramento, from Fresno, from nomad chapters Wyatt had never heard of. They kept coming. The driveway filled. The clearing in front of the cabin became a sea of motorcycles parked with absolute precision. Wyatt did a quick count as they cut their engines one by one, the silence falling in a cascading wave. 102 bikes. Over 100 patched members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club standing in his front yard. Wyatt stood completely still, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a social call. This was something else, something that transcended normal human interaction. The sheer overwhelming presence of that many outlaws was enough to make a lesser man run. But Wyatt had faced worse odds and survived. He stayed where he was, hand on his weapon, and waited. Reaper dismounted slowly, pulling off his heavy leather gloves. He walked up to the edge of the porch, followed by Clutch, who walked with a pronounced limp, but moved with purpose. The young man's leg had healed, though the scar would last forever. "Wyatt," Reaper said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "Reaper," Wyatt nodded respectfully. His eyes flicked to the army of bikers behind the president. "That's a lot of iron for a social call." A low rumble of laughter rolled through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. "We didn't come for a social call, brother," Reaper said. He gestured to Clutch, who stepped forward. Clutch looked at Wyatt, his eyes filled with an intensity that made the moment feel sacred. He extended his hand. Wyatt took it. The young man's grip was strong now, fully recovered. "The doctors in Oakland said another 20 minutes and I would have lost the leg," Clutch said, his voice thick. "Another hour and I would have bled out. You saved my life, Mr. Brennan. The club owes you my life." "You're walking on both feet," Wyatt said quietly. "That's all the thanks I need." Forge stepped up onto the first step of the porch. In his massive hands, he carried a heavy wooden plaque beautifully carved from dark mahogany and varnished to a high shine. He knelt down, and only then did Wyatt realize Bryn had come up from the tree line and was standing beside him. "Hey there, little bird," Forge rumbled, his scarred face splitting into a gentle smile. "You still got that horse I made you?" Bryn nodded enthusiastically. "He guards my room every night, Mr. Dragon." Forge chuckled to sound like distant thunder. He stood and handed the plaque to Wyatt. "This is for you, from all of us." Wyatt looked down at it. Burned into the wood was a beautifully rendered image of the Hells Angels' death's head, but instead of the standard club text, the words curving around the skull read, "Protected by the Brotherhood. This property is sanctuary. You hang that on your gate at the bottom of the driveway," Reaper instructed, his tone absolutely serious. "You hang it where everyone can see it. No thief, no drifter, no gang, and no corrupt cop will ever step foot on this mountain knowing what happens if they disrespect that sign." Before Wyatt could respond, Blade walked up carrying a sealed manila envelope. He handed it to Wyatt. "What's this?" Wyatt asked, feeling the weight of paper inside. "Open it later," Reaper said. "It's the contact information for a trust lawyer in San Francisco. The money from Clutch's saddlebag, we used most of it to set his family right, paid off the debts, got the farm back, but there was a surplus. That envelope contains information for an irrevocable trust in Bryn's name. College, a house, whatever she needs when she turns 18. It's all legal, washed clean through 3 different legitimate businesses." Wyatt felt his throat tighten. He looked at the envelope, then at the sea of rough, scarred, violent men standing in his yard. Men as society had labeled as monsters and criminals. Yet here they were securing his daughter's future. "I don't know what to say." "You don't say anything," Reaper replied, his voice gentle. "You just know that you're not alone up here anymore. You have a family now, a different kind of family, but family nonetheless." Reaper turned to address the assembled angels. He raised his fist in the air. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. 102 fists punched toward the sky, accompanied by a roar of approval that echoed off the mountain peaks and rolled down into the valleys below. Reaper turned back to Wyatt, and his voice dropped to something only they could hear. "You need to know something. 2 weeks after we left this mountain, The Oakland, Sacramento, and Reno charters paid a visit to the cartel's operation. We burned their stash houses to the ground. We took their leadership for a very long, very final ride into the desert. The Reno cartel doesn't exist anymore. They will never come for you or Bryn. You're safe forever. The magnitude of what Reaper was saying settled over Wyatt like a cloak. An entire criminal organization had been dismantled and destroyed to ensure his safety. The scale of the violence committed in his name was staggering. And yet, looking at Bryn standing beside him, innocent and safe, he couldn't bring himself to feel anything but gratitude. "You didn't have to go to war for me," Wyatt said quietly. "Yes, we did," Reaper replied simply. "We protect our own. And whether you fly our colors or not, you're our own. You bled for us. That's all that matters." The next hour became something Wyatt would remember for the rest of his life. The isolated mountain cabin transformed into a gathering unlike anything these peaks had ever seen. 102 angels spread out across the property, but they were respectful. They didn't trash anything. They didn't get drunk or rowdy. They treated Wyatt's home like the sanctuary it had become. Forge sat in the grass with Bryn teaching her how to whittle a small wooden dog with a pocket knife, his massive hands gentle and patient. Vandal told stories about riding cross-country, his deep voice animated in a way Wyatt hadn't seen before. Clutch sat with Wyatt on the porch steps talking about his father, about the farm they had gotten back, about the future he was going to build. "I'm going back to school," Clutch said. "Gonna study business, run the farm, right? Make it profitable enough to give back to the club the way my dad would have wanted." "Your father would be proud," Wyatt said. "He would have liked you," Clutch replied. "You're the same kind of man he was. Stand by your principles even when it costs you everything." When it was time to leave, the thunder returned. 102 engines fired up in near-perfect synchronization, a sound so massive it felt like the mountain itself was coming alive. The roar shook dust from the cabin rafters and sent birds scattering from the trees. Reaper shook Wyatt's hand one last time, the grip firm and brief. "You ever need anything, brother? Anything at all, you know how to reach us. Ride safe, Reaper." The president touched the brim of his helmet to Bryn in a gesture of respect, then kicked his bike into gear. The river of leather and chrome began to flow back down the mountain, a serpentine column of controlled power that seemed to go on forever. Wyatt and Bryn stood on the porch, the newly carved plaque resting against the railing beside them, and watched until the last bike disappeared around the final bend. They watched until the sound faded into the gentle rustle of the Sierra pines. They watched until the mountain reclaimed its silence. Bryn looked up at her father. "Daddy, are they really our family now?" Wyatt knelt down beside her, looking into eyes that held her mother's wisdom and her own unique courage. "A kind of family, yes, a strange one. But family is the people who show up when you need them, who protect you when you're in danger, who make sure you're safe even when they're gone. Like you do for me, like I do for you," Wyatt agreed. He pulled her into a hug, feeling the warm mountain sun on his back, the plaque that promised eternal protection beside him, and the weight of choices that had changed everything. He had been a combat medic who swore to save lives. He had become a father trying to raise a daughter in peace. And on one frozen night when strangers came to his door, he had become something else entirely. A bridge between worlds. A man who stood at the intersection of law and justice and chose the harder path. The years that followed would prove the truth of Reaper's promise. The plaque went up on the gate at the bottom of the driveway, and word spread through the criminal underworld faster than wildfire. The cabin on Route 89 was off limits, sacred ground, protected by an army that would materialize like ghosts if anyone was foolish enough to test that protection. Wyatt never called in the marker. He never needed to. But knowing it was there, knowing that Bryn would grow up under that invisible shield, allowed him to sleep at night in a way he hadn't since Nora died. The trust fund grew. When Bryn turned 18, it would pay for college, for a house, for whatever dreams she chose to pursue. Money that had started as blood and theft had been transformed into something clean and purposeful. A future built on the ashes of the past. The wooden horse that Forge carved still sat on Bryn's nightstand guarding her room. The medallion Reaper had given him hung in Wyatt's workshop, a reminder of the covenant that had been forged in a blizzard. And every year on the anniversary of that night, Wyatt would pour a cup of coffee, walk out to the porch, and look down the mountain, where the angels had arrived and departed like a force of nature. He had saved 15 men in a storm. They had saved his soul in the aftermath. The exchange was unequal, but debt wasn't measured in mathematics. It was measured in the willingness to stand beside someone when the world was ending and say, "I'm with you." As the sun climbed higher over the Sierra Nevada peaks, painting the snow-capped mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Wyatt picked up the plaque and walked down to the gate. He mounted it on the heavy wooden post, the mahogany dark and rich against the weathered wood. The death's head skull gleamed in the sunlight, and the words beneath it were carved deep enough to last generations. Protected by the Brotherhood. This property is sanctuary. He stepped back and looked at it, this declaration that changed everything. Then he turned and walked back up the driveway to where Bryn was waiting on the porch, the wooden dog Forge had taught her to carve, held carefully in her small hands. "Is it up, Daddy?" "It's up, Bug." "Good," she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Now we're safe forever." Wyatt looked down at his daughter at the cabin behind her that had become a fortress at the mountains, that had witnessed everything and kept their secrets. He thought about the choices he had made, the lines he had crossed, the covenant he had entered into with men the world called criminals. And he thought about the medic who had sworn to preserve life, who had held that oath sacred through 2 tours of war. That man would have been horrified by the violence, by the lies, by the alliance with outlaws. But that man had never been a father protecting his daughter. "Yeah, Bug," Wyatt said softly, pulling her close. "We're safe forever." And for the first time since Nora died, he believed it. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the distant echo of 100 engines that had thundered through and left everything changed. Somewhere down in the valleys, the Hells Angels were riding toward whatever battles awaited them, secure in the knowledge that they had left one of their own protected. And on a high ridge in the Sierra Nevadas, a former combat medic and his 7-year-old daughter stood together in the sunlight, guarded by an invisible army, bound by a covenant written in blood and snow, and unshakable loyalty. The promise remained carved into wood and burned into memory forever.